He was the man nobody noticed. Just the janitor. Quiet. Alone. Always sweeping floors before the sun came up. But when a homemade bomb appeared outside an elementary school in Boston, he stepped forward. And in less than 2 minutes, the truth exploded louder than any device ever could. He wasn't just a janitor. He was the most respected bomb disposal expert in military history. This is the story of Frank Mallory. A man with a buried past, a broken heart, and one final mission he never expected. Stay with us. You won't forget him. If you believe ordinary people can be heroes, hit that like button. It helps others discover stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, human-centered narratives like this one. Now we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Frank's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. The morning air in Boston carried with it the faint scent of dew and distant saltwater from the harbor. It was just past 6 o'clock, and the city had not yet shaken off the quiet of dawn. A low sun cast golden light across the red brick buildings of Eastfield Elementary School, making the old schoolhouse windows gleam as though blinking slowly awake. Frank Mallory turned the key in the school's side door, the familiar metallic click echoing through the empty hall. He moved with a deliberate rhythm, not hurried, not sluggish. His mop, slung over one shoulder, swayed gently with each step. Frank was in his late 60s, his silver hair always neatly combed back, and his deep-set eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen far more than he ever spoke about. He had been the janitor at Eastfield for almost 7 years. The children barely noticed him. The teachers acknowledged him with polite nods and small waves, but rarely words. He preferred it that way. His voice was soft and his demeanor even softer, but there was something about the way he observed everything, the way he moved through the halls as if cataloging every creak and corner. Each day began the same. Frank unlocked the doors, turned off the alarm, and walked the length of the main corridor, checking each classroom. He cleaned the desks with silent care, emptied the trash bins with methodical precision, and made sure the bulletin boards were straight. When the children began pouring in, he was already tucked away in the utility closet near the cafeteria, sipping weak coffee from a thermos that had faded from black to gray. No one knew where Frank went after work. He declined invitations to staff dinners and never attended school events. Once a teacher asked where he was from. He simply said, "Out west," and offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The only trace of a personal life he ever revealed was a single photograph taped inside his locker, hidden behind rolls of paper towels and boxes of light bulbs. It showed a young man in military fatigues, grinning beside a tank, arms slung around someone just out of frame. The picture was old and sun-bleached, but Frank looked at it often, as if drawing something from it before stepping out into the world. Despite his silence, people respected Frank. Not because of anything he said, but because of how he carried himself. When a pipe burst one winter, flooding the north wing of the school, he was already there before the principal arrived. When a student had a panic attack in the hallway, Frank was the one who calmly led him to the nurse's office, placing a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. He spoke very little, but when he did, it mattered. There was something else, an unspoken certainty among the older teachers that Frank had lived another life before this one. A life not just of labor, but of meaning. Something buried deep beneath his silence. It wasn't until the day of the threat that the truth began to surface. But before that, Frank Mallory was simply the janitor. The man who swept the floors, replaced flickering lights, and disappeared into the boiler room without a sound. That morning, as he locked up the supply closet and headed toward the courtyard with a trash bag in hand, no one imagined that by sundown the entire city would know his name. He was just Frank, the quiet custodian. The sun climbed higher over Boston, casting long shadows across the schoolyard as the day unfolded. In room 12B, 5th grade students were halfway through their morning grammar lesson. Miss Ramirez, a kind and sharp-eyed teacher with a knack for keeping her class both focused and curious, paused mid-sentence when she saw Amira Castillo staring out the window. Amira wasn't the type to daydream. She was bright, observant, and usually more interested in catching a misplaced comma than watching the trees sway. But today something had caught her attention. Outside, near the corner of the building by the maintenance shed, Frank Mallory moved like clockwork. He wasn't sweeping or emptying bins this time. He was kneeling beside the chain-link fence, running a hand slowly along one of the support posts, eyes narrowed. His fingers paused briefly at a screw near the base, then he stood and casually walked away. Amira's curiosity stirred. Later that afternoon, while most kids were pouring into the cafeteria, Amira stayed behind for tutoring. Her math had slipped a little and she was trying hard to catch up. Afterward, instead of heading straight home, she wandered the hallway near the boiler room where Frank was known to disappear. The halls were quiet, save for the faint humming of vents and the echo of a basketball bouncing in the gym. She found him crouched next to a radiator in the east wing, a wrench in hand. Steam hissed faintly from a loose valve. Frank twisted the wrench gently, watching the gauge. When he noticed Amira standing there, he didn't startle. He simply looked up and nodded. "You fix all that stuff by yourself?" she asked. "Usually," Frank replied, tightening one final bolt. "Some things can't wait for a work order." There was a quietness between them that felt deliberate, like neither of them wanted to disturb the calm. Amira stepped closer, watching as Frank placed the tools back into a perfectly organized toolbox. "You always check the pipes and doors like that?" Frank looked at her, expression unreadable. "I like to know when something's out of place," he said. It wasn't the kind of answer she expected. Most grown-ups would brush her off or laugh it off. But Frank answered with the kind of honesty that didn't invite more questions. That night, Amira sat at the kitchen table while her mother cooked arroz con pollo. Her notebook lay open in front of her, but she was doodling instead of doing her homework. She drew the school building, then sketched Frank walking through it like a sentry. In the margins, she scribbled a few words. "He doesn't walk like a janitor. He walks like he's on patrol." The next day, she started watching more closely. While her classmates laughed at recess, she watched Frank check the emergency exit doors. He didn't just glance at them. He tested the handles, inspected the frames. He looked up at the roofline, then down along the storm drains. And once, when a garbage truck pulled up late to the school lot, she saw Frank stop mid-routine, take a few steps back, and stare at the truck's license plate. Just for a second. Then he moved on as if nothing happened. Amira told her tutor what she'd seen. The woman laughed lightly and said, "He's probably just a creature of habit." But Amira knew better. Something about Frank felt too practiced, too exact. She began walking by the utility closet on purpose, hoping to catch glimpses of the photo inside his locker. Once, the door was left slightly open and she spotted it, just for a moment. The man in the photo looked younger, stronger, but she recognized the same eyes. Serious eyes. Watchful eyes. Amira started writing about him in her journal. Not as a janitor, but as someone who had a secret. She didn't think of it as spying. She thought of it as paying attention. She was learning, slowly, that sometimes you discover more by watching quietly than by asking loud questions. What she couldn't yet know was that her instincts were sharper than most adults. She noticed the little things, the subtle things, the same way Frank Mallory did. And before long, those instincts would place her at the center of something far more dangerous than forgotten homework or hallway mysteries. The day was coming when all of Boston would see the man Frank truly was. But for now, he was still the quiet custodian, and Amira Castillo was the only one really watching. It began with a janitor's instinct and a child's eyes. The day was colder than usual, with the sky over Boston turning a pale gray. A nor'easter had passed through the night before, soaking the playground and blanketing it with layers of slick, drying mud. Despite the damp conditions, recess had resumed as usual. Children ran between puddles and climbed across wet jungle gyms, their coats dotted with specks of leftover rain. Frank stood by the east wing entrance, broom in hand but unmoving. His eyes scanned the yard without urgency. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but he noticed when things didn't belong. It was Amira who found the bag. She had been following her usual path to the tetherball court when something caught her eye. Just under the metal slide, half hidden by a pile of wet leaves, was a backpack. It wasn't colorful like the ones most kids carried. This one was dull green, worn at the edges with no name tag. She crouched beside it, then froze. There was something taped to the top. A piece of white paper, folded and plastic wrapped, with a single line written in thick black marker. "Do not touch. Bomb inside." For a moment, Amira thought it had to be a prank. A bad joke. But the handwriting was shaky and messy, and the bag, it didn't feel like part of a game. She backed away slowly. Teachers began to notice her hesitation and gathered around. Within minutes, the school went into lockdown. Sirens echoed across the blocks. Teachers ushered students inside. Parents were called. An evacuation was ordered for the eastern classrooms. Frank had moved the second the first alarm blared. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for instructions. While the principal shouted directions into her walkie-talkie and the faculty scrambled to check attendance, Frank was already walking across the wet grass toward the playground. Someone tried to stop him, a younger teacher who barely knew his name, but Frank raised one hand without speaking, and somehow that was enough. He knelt beside the bag, brushing away the leaves. His movements were slow. Purposeful. Controlled. Inside the front pocket of his uniform, Frank pulled out a small folding tool kit. Not the kind you'd find in a janitor's closet. These were modified. Clean. Military grade. Hidden among the screwdrivers and pliers was a tiny flashlight, a pair of wire cutters, and a flat plastic mirror. He didn't panic. He didn't fumble. Frank angled the mirror beneath the bag and studied the bottom. Then he lay flat on the ground, pressing his ear to the wet grass, listening. The Boston Police Department arrived within 10 minutes. The bomb squad was still 30 minutes out. But Frank had already started. Carefully, he unzipped the top flap and peered inside. What he found confirmed his worst fear. Wires. A timer. A crude but real explosive device made from everyday items. Someone had built this and they knew what they were doing. Frank cut the first wire. Then the second. The wind picked up as the crowd of teachers and officers watched from the windows. Amira, hidden behind the cafeteria counter with other students, clutched her journal tightly. She didn't know why, but she knew, absolutely, that Frank was the right person to be down there. 10 more minutes passed. Then, at precisely 11:37 a.m., Frank stood up, wiped his hands on a rag from his belt, and gave the officers a nod. "It's safe now," he said quietly. "You can call off the squad." No drama. No celebration. Just a calm return to silence. That night, the story broke on every local station in Massachusetts. By morning, national networks were airing footage of the incident. A blurry still image, captured from a teacher's phone, showed an older man kneeling beside a suspected bomb, while uniformed officers stood yards away behind cover. The headlines followed. Boston janitor prevents bombing at elementary school. Hero custodian identified as former military specialist. Quiet man, loud impact. Frank Mallory's name was out. His past was no longer buried beneath boiler rooms and mop buckets. And suddenly everyone wanted to know, who was this man? By the time the late evening news aired, Frank Mallory's name was trending across the city. Teachers who had worked alongside him for years now stood stunned in front of their televisions. Parents who had passed him daily without a second glance were dialing each other, sharing the news with disbelief. The man who had swept their classrooms, cleaned their messes, fixed their broken locks, had once been the most respected bomb disposal expert in American military history. Journalists dug deep. By sunrise, a clearer picture had begun to form. Francis J. Mallory, former Master Sergeant, United States Army, decorated specialist in explosive ordnance disposal. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 2 in Iraq. Commendations for valor. Over 200 active field disarmaments. His record was clean. Impressive. Near mythical among certain circles. And then he vanished. No interviews. No book deals. No lectures or public recognition. The military never said much, only that he'd retired early and moved east. The rest was silence. But the silence was louder now. In the teacher's lounge at Eastfield Elementary, the staff huddled around an old laptop, watching a grainy interview from 15 years ago. In it, a younger Frank sat in full uniform beside a military official. His voice was deeper than stronger. He spoke plainly, describing a mission where he had disarmed a roadside bomb with only his pocket tools and an improvised mirror. The anchor asked him why he did it instead of waiting for backup. "Sometimes," Frank had said, "you're the only one there. So you go." The room fell quiet. In the back of the cafeteria, Amira sat alone, holding her journal in her lap. Her parents had been on the phone nonstop since the lockdown, but her thoughts were still on the man who had walked toward the danger while everyone else moved away from it. She had always felt something different about him. Now she had proof. The next morning, Frank didn't show up at the usual hour. The school opened late as investigators combed through the grounds. Officers confirmed the bomb was real, homemade, unstable, and placed intentionally. But no fingerprints had been found. The note was printed on standard copy paper. The backpack itself was untraceable. The trail ended cold. Around 10, Frank arrived without ceremony, walking through the front doors in his work boots, thermos in hand. He looked tired, older, but unchanged. He made his way through the school without a word. Some staff tried to speak to him, to thank him, to apologize for not knowing, but he just nodded gently, gave them that same quiet smile, and continued down the hall. It was Principal Donahue who finally cornered him in the supply room. "I owe you more than I can say," she told him. "But I have to ask, why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Frank set down a box of light bulbs and looked at her. His voice was steady. "Because it didn't matter. Not here. You saved lives, Frank." He gave a small nod. "That's the job," he said. "It's always been the job. But you could have gone anywhere after you left the service. Why here? Why this school?" Frank paused as if weighing how much of himself to share. "My son was supposed to start teaching here," he said. "Back in 2013. He died overseas before he got the chance." The words landed with quiet weight. The principal didn't speak, just listened. "I came here because it felt like the closest I could get to him," Frank added. "This place, these kids. It helped." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Later that day, Amira left a note on the bench outside the cafeteria. It was written on a torn sheet of notebook paper. No name, no questions. Just a few sentences. "I saw you before everyone else did. You're not just brave. You're kind. I'm going to notice the quiet people more now. Thanks, Mr. Mallory." Frank found it before he left that evening. He folded it carefully as if it were something fragile and slipped it into the back of his wallet. Then he picked up his mop and went back to work. Because to him it was never about the recognition. It was about what needed to be done. And that, more than anything, was who he really was. 3 days after the bomb was found, Frank Mallory sat at the far end of the school parking lot, inside his beat-up Ford pickup, watching the children file in under the watch of extra patrol cars. It was early, earlier than usual, but sleep had become a stranger again. The nightmares were back. He had hoped those were gone for good. Boston PD had asked him to consult on the investigation. The detectives were young, capable, and mostly respectful. But Frank declined their formal offer. He wasn't ready to step back into that world. Not fully. The uniform, the endless protocols, the media noise. He didn't miss any of it. What he missed was silence, and he was willing to mop 10,000 floors to protect it. But something had shifted. The damage done wasn't just a routine. It had pierced the illusion of safety the school had always relied on. Metal detectors were being considered. Staff were undergoing emergency response training. There were rumors of transferring vulnerable students to other campuses. Frank hated all of it. That morning, after finishing his rounds in the boiler room, he returned to the spot where the bag had been found. The grass was still trampled from the day of the lockdown. Police tape had long been removed, but the air around the slide still felt heavier somehow. He looked down at the dirt. Then he knelt. Not because he expected to find anything, but because he had a habit of returning to places where danger had visited. He called it walking the ghost back, retracing the threat's path so it could be properly laid to rest in his mind. While on the ground, he saw something others had missed, a trail of small rust flakes, leading away from the fence line. Almost like someone had dropped a piece of corroded metal and walked east. He followed it to the alley behind the maintenance shed. There, wedged between the wall and a discarded air vent, was a bolt cutter. Not from the school's inventory. It was marked with black tape around the handles, military style. Frank froze. He looked around. The alley was narrow, shaded by the tall red brick of the east wing. No cameras. No sight lines from the classrooms. If someone had breached the grounds, this was likely where they came in. His instincts came alive again. Later that day, when the last bell rang, Frank requested a meeting with the lead detective assigned to the case. He didn't share everything. Just enough. The person who placed that device, Frank said, knew how to avoid attention. They knew this school. This layout. That bomb wasn't just about causing panic. It was a test. A warm-up. The detective looked skeptical. "You think there's more coming?" "I think whoever did this isn't finished," Frank replied. "And they're counting on us to return to normal." The warning was noted. But only that. No further action was taken. That night, Frank unlocked his footlocker at home, the one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were items wrapped in cloth, disarming tools, tactical gloves, a field manual with torn edges, and one faded photograph of a young man in army fatigues, his son Owen. Frank sat on the edge of his bed for a long while, the tools spread before him. He didn't want to return to this life, but maybe he never truly left. The next morning he arrived at school an hour before sunrise. He walked the perimeter again, mapped the sight lines from every door, and noted the blind spots in the camera system. He didn't need orders. This was how he grieved, through vigilance. By the time the children arrived, the school was safer than it had ever been. No one noticed Frank standing near the flagpole, watching. But he was always there. Eyes sharp. Posture alert. The janitor had returned to duty. And though he wore no badge and gave no commands, the war inside him had found a new battlefield. He would not let harm come to these kids. Not again. It began with a scent. 3 days after Frank had found the bolt cutter near the alley wall, A thin trail of information had started to emerge. Nothing official, just whispers. Something about a former student, recently expelled, known for anger issues and a fascination with explosives. No charges. No surveillance footage. Nothing concrete enough to move on. But Frank had learned a long time ago that most threats don't announce themselves. They leak through cracks. That morning he received an envelope in his janitor's locker. No return address. No note. Just a single grainy photo clipped from a traffic camera. In it, a hooded figure moved through the alleyway behind the school at 4:18 a.m., the same route Frank had investigated earlier. The image was creased, handled several times before it ever reached him. He didn't tell the police. Instead, he made copies and circled the time and location in red. Then he returned to the alley that evening once the school had cleared out. He watched, listened, timed the streetlights. He memorized the delivery truck schedules, the motion sensor triggers, the blind angles. He studied the rhythm of neglect and the patterns of someone watching from a distance. Boston was no stranger to shadows, but this one had intent. By Friday, a string of anonymous emails began reaching the school's front office. Short, threatening messages sent from encrypted accounts. They referenced the next lesson and the real target. The messages were forwarded to police, but Frank could tell from the tone, they weren't bluffing. This was someone with a grudge. And that someone was circling back. It was then that Frank returned to the one place he had avoided since Owen's funeral, the basement armory of his old friend, Mike Hernandez. Mike was a former Army engineer turned gun range operator on the outskirts of Boston. He'd always stayed in touch, even when Frank tried to disappear. And when Frank showed up unannounced, Mike didn't ask why, just opened the gate. "You look like hell," Mike said, handing him a black duffel bag. "That yours?" "It is now," Frank replied. Inside were updated tools of the trade. A fiber optic camera, a signal jammer, small packets of C4 meant for safe detonation, and a modified headset with noise dampening. It was more than Frank needed, but not more than he could handle. "You gonna tell me who you're after?" Mike asked. Frank shook his head. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." That night, Frank returned to the school and entered through the West Wing maintenance door. He disabled the alarms manually and set up 2 pressure-sensitive strips beneath the windows closest to the alley. A small vibration sensor was placed on the chain-link fence. No backup. No authorization. Just a one-man stakeout. He spent the night inside the boiler room, flashlight off, waiting. At 2:54 a.m., a faint click echoed down the hallway. Footsteps. Light. Cautious. Frank rose from his chair without sound and slipped into the darkened hallway, stepping between puddles of moonlight. From the glow of the exit sign, he saw movement, a figure crouching near the lockers. He didn't shout. He didn't chase. Instead, he moved along the adjacent corridor, closing the distance from the rear. It was like clockwork, the rhythm of hunting in silence. The same way he had once moved through Afghan desert towns, listening for the scrape of pressure plates beneath the sand. The intruder pulled out a flat package from his backpack, tape already in hand. Frank stepped forward and clicked on his flashlight. The boy froze. 17, maybe 18. Pale face. Hoodie pulled tight. His hands shook, but not from fear, from adrenaline. "I wouldn't finish that," Frank said calmly. The boy turned, startled, and dropped the package. Wire spilled out. Frank kicked it back away from the lockers and pulled out a small jamming device, switching it on. The red indicator blinked. A signal block was in effect. No cell trigger. No remote detonation. Just wires and bad decisions, Frank said, stepping closer. "You don't know what they did to me," the boy spat. "They ruined my life." Frank's voice didn't rise. "You were a kid. You still are. But the moment you plant something that can kill people, you stop being one." The boy pulled a switchblade, his hands slick with sweat. Frank disarmed him in 2 moves. By the time the school security arrived, rattled and confused, Frank had already zip-tied the boy's wrists and marked the device as stable. He didn't speak to the responding officers, just handed them a report scribbled on lined notebook paper. When asked how he knew the suspect would return, he simply said, "Because he wanted to be seen." The boy, now in custody, would later confess everything. The bomb near the slide. The test run. This one? Meant for the staff lounge. He had been expelled a year earlier for threatening behavior and felt the school had robbed him of a future. No one had noticed the signs. Except Frank. By morning, Eastfield Elementary was back in the news. But this time the story was different. Second bomb attempt foiled by hero custodian. Retired bomb tech stops copycat attack at Boston school. Frank Mallory, janitor, soldier, guardian. But Frank didn't hear the news. He was already back in the hallway, replacing a cracked ceiling tile and tightening a loose doorknob. Because once the work is done, there's always more to do. Monday morning came with a bitter sky and the distant echo of sirens from somewhere far off in the city. Inside Eastfield Elementary, however, the building was calm. Not normal. No school ever returns fully to normal after nearly being the site of a second bombing, but calm and under control. Frank Mallory stood at the edge of the auditorium stage as the principal gave her speech. The students were seated cross-legged on the floor, their faces tired but attentive. Their teachers flanked the aisles, smiling faintly, whispering instructions now and then. The staff had voted unanimously to keep the assembly low-key. No media. No forced applause. Just one moment to acknowledge what nearly happened, and the man who had stopped it. The principal cleared her throat. "We have someone here who most of you know by name. Or maybe just by his mop bucket." Chuckles spread through the rows of children. "But after this week, I think it's safe to say Mr. Frank Mallory is more than just our janitor. He's the reason we're all here, whole and safe." Frank didn't move. He hadn't wanted a speech. He hadn't wanted recognition. But out of respect, he walked slowly to the microphone. His clothes were the same as always, gray shirt, clean but faded, and boots that had seen more years than most of the audience. He adjusted the mic, glanced at the sea of eyes watching him, and said only this: "You don't need to thank me. Just take care of each other. Every day. That's how we make it." He stepped back before applause could start. The auditorium remained hushed, as if something sacred had passed through the room. Later that day, Frank found himself alone in the hallway again. But this time it was different. As he polished the floors, he noticed the small things, the way students smiled at him now, not nervously but with warmth. The way a third grader left a drawing taped to the janitor's closet door. It showed a stick figure in a brown cap standing on top of a bomb with a broom in hand and the words, "You saved my school," in crayon beneath it. He took it down gently and folded it into his back pocket. By Wednesday, the superintendent of Boston Public Schools came to offer him a formal commendation. He declined. Said it was just instinct. When they pushed for an interview, he told them his work wasn't finished. That there were still lockers sticking, pipes leaking, windows that didn't close right. The media got their headlines anyway. But the truth stayed buried where Frank liked it. He never told them about the box of tools he kept now, hidden beneath the floorboards of the boiler room. Or the list of former students he began watching out for quietly, kids who'd shown signs of trouble. Kids like the one he stopped. He started leaving notes in teachers' mailboxes. Not signed, just observations. Warnings sometimes. Praise other times. One counselor began calling him her phantom advisor. Some thought it was strange. Others just called it care. Weeks turned into months. The school year wound down. The trees along the Boston sidewalk thickened into full summer, and still Frank came to work early and left late. Not out of duty, but out of something deeper. A promise. A second chance. One day, just before final exams, he visited the old janitor's locker room and opened the last unused cabinet. Inside, he placed his son's photograph, Owen in full army uniform, and pinned the drawing from the third grader beneath it. He stepped back and took in the view. A soldier. A child. A quiet hall. He closed the locker door gently. Outside, a bell rang and feet thundered through the corridors. A teacher waved at him as she passed. Frank nodded once, a subtle curve of the mouth forming, not quite a smile but close. Because for the first time in a long while, he felt it. Not just purpose, but peace. The war inside him had not disappeared, but it no longer defined him. And in the quiet rhythm of brooms and footsteps and school bells, Frank Mallory had found something stronger than revenge or grief. He had found home. The end. 7 moral lessons from the story of Frank Mallory. 1. True strength lies in quiet action. In a world that often rewards noise and recognition, Frank Mallory's story reminds us that real strength does not always come with a spotlight. He did not need applause, medals, or headlines to validate his actions. His bravery was expressed through silence, through routine, through doing what needed to be done without asking for anything in return. This challenges the assumption that leadership must be loud or that courage demands center stage. Instead, Frank teaches us that some of the most powerful people in any community are those who act with quiet integrity, never seeking credit but always standing ready when others falter. 2. Pain can be transformed into purpose. Frank's life was defined by profound personal loss. His only son, Owen, died in the war, the very cause to which Frank had once given his life. Many would have folded under that kind of grief. Some would have vanished from the world entirely. Frank nearly did. But rather than let pain harden him or lead him into bitterness, he allowed it to carve out a deeper sense of duty within him. His return to service, this time in a modest school janitor's uniform, was not a retreat from life, but a re-entry into it. He chose to protect the vulnerable in memory of what he had lost, proving that pain, while often unbearable, can also shape a deeper purpose. 3. Never underestimate the value of ordinary roles. There is a lesson here about how society undervalues certain types of work. Janitors are rarely seen as protectors or central figures in a school's life. Yet, in this story, the man with the mop and the keys became the silent guardian of hundreds of children. The message is clear: there are no small roles in a community. Every job, every presence, every hand that helps keep things running carries the potential to save lives, even if no one is watching. It is a call to treat all people with respect, not based on title but on character. 4. Listening and observation are underrated superpowers. Unlike law enforcement, who needed evidence, and school administrators, who looked for patterns in behavior, Frank relied on instinct, attention, and a deep understanding of human nature. He listened to what others dismissed. He noticed when something was out of place, not because he was trained to detect threats anymore, but because he paid attention. This reinforces a crucial moral lesson: awareness is powerful. In relationships, in communities, and in danger, those who truly listen and observe are often the ones who protect, heal, and lead effectively. 5. Redemption is found in the service of others. Frank never considered himself a hero. He carried guilt, grief, and the ghost of a past he could not change. Yet through his service to the school, he slowly carved out a new version of himself, not by erasing the past but by allowing his actions to reframe it. He didn't run from who he was. He didn't try to undo what had been lost. Instead, he allowed his next chapter to become an act of quiet redemption. His life teaches us that we don't always get closure from the world. Sometimes we have to write our own. And the most healing way to do that is to give something meaningful back to others. 6. Courage is defined by what you do when no one is watching. One of the most striking elements of the story is that Frank didn't wait for recognition. He didn't act only once people began to suspect danger. He was already watching, already guarding, already preparing long before anyone even knew something was wrong. That is what separates momentary bravery from lasting courage. Doing what is right when no one is asking you to. When it would be easier to do nothing. When no one would blame you for walking away. Frank's vigilance is a reminder that heroism is not a reaction to fear, but a discipline of doing the right thing consistently, even in solitude. 7. Healing begins where you plant your care. Lastly, the story offers a reflection on healing, not just from grief but from anger, isolation, and disconnection. Frank had every reason to disappear into the background of life, and for a time he did. But he chose to plant himself in a place that needed him. A place where his care would matter. And through his quiet work, both in fixing the broken parts of a school and guarding its people, he began to heal. This final lesson is about the power of presence. When we pour care into a community, a family, a cause, or a person, we do not just protect them, we start to mend ourselves. Because healing does not always come from looking inward. Sometimes it grows from reaching outward. Closing reflection. The story of Frank Mallory is not just one of suspense or redemption. It is a guide to character. A reminder that ordinary people carry extraordinary potential, and that even the most broken hearts can become the safest havens. Each lesson, each choice, each quiet act of courage, these are not only the markers of a fictional hero, but the blueprint for any of us who wonder how to make meaning from pain, and how to leave behind something better than what we found. Disclaimer. The story presented in this video is entirely fictional. All characters, events, and settings are the product of creative storytelling and do not depict any actual persons, places, or incidents. This content is intended solely for educational and inspirational purposes, offering moral lessons, motivation, and insight into themes such as courage, redemption, and quiet heroism. Viewer discretion is advised, and any resemblance to real individuals or events is purely coincidental. Thank you for watching and listening to the story of Frank Mallory, the janitor who showed us that true courage often lives in the quietest places. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, please consider liking the video. It really helps support the channel and brings more stories like this to viewers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos filled with powerful tales, meaningful lessons, and real human experiences. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Frank's story resonated the most with you? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts with our community. Thanks again for being here. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones you never expect.